In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Millions died in pursuit of conquering this unknown land. The European powers of the time took part in colonization, and the centuries after witnessed remarkable wars and a new age of influence. These events led to the birth of a new nation on July 4th, 1776, the United States of America. Since the USA has conquered the world in every aspect possible, from developing the most powerful military in modern history to countless astonishing human accomplishments, the country has earned the name the modern Roman Empire. But can this giant continue its dominance? To understand the story of this fascinating land, we must start from the very beginning. Long before European colonization, the native peoples of North America had developed complex and sophisticated systems of society and government. Hundreds of thousands warred, made peace, and governed over specific regions, and had done so for thousands of years. By the time the first European explorers began to arrive on the North American continent in the 15th century, the Native Americans had already established themselves and their communities for thousands of years. The North American continent, vast and rich with natural resources, would beckon all who came to know of its shores. And so when a Norse navigator named Leif Erikson learned that there was a land west of Greenland from fellow explorer Bjarne Haraldson, he made preparations to set sail. Harry Olsen, who had been blown off course while sailing, had accidentally discovered what would one day be called Newfoundland. And although he did not land, his story gave Erikson the information he needed to successfully sail across the Labrador Sea and make landfall in North America. Erikson and the Norsemen would establish a small settlement in Labrador called Lonzo Meadows, or Meadows Cove. This settlement and numerous small outposts built nearby, it would be abandoned over the course of about 20 years. Afterward, it would be nearly another 500 years before Europeans set foot on the shores of North America. Searching for a more direct and faster route to India, the great European powers of the age sent dozens of expeditions around the globe. In October 1492, the Genovese explorer Christopher Columbus, employed by the King and Queen of Spain, discovered the West Indies and inadvertently opened a new frontier of exploration. Popularized as the New World by Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, it was open season for European explorers, traders, and businessmen alike. European powers began claiming sections of this new world as their own with every major exploratory mission. Vespucci, who created and sold maps of his own discoveries in the New World, gained the notable distinction of having the entire hemisphere named for him. America, while much of the early exploration of the New World focused on what would become known as the Caribbean and South America, it did not take long before explorers turned their attention to the enormous landmass above Columbus's Hispaniola. At the dawn of the 16th century, the Spanish, English, Portuguese, Swedish, Dutch, and French all entered a race to explore and map the entire east coast of North America. In 1497, Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, known as John Cabot by his English employers, discovered the same region of Newfoundland that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had settled. Nearly 500 years earlier, Cabot's discoveries credited him as the discoverer of the North American continent, as no record of Erikson's expedition or settlement had yet been discovered. To the south, expeditions by Juan Ponce de Leon, Alvar Núñez, Cabeza de Vaca, and Hernando de Soto would map Florida and the American SE as Spain prepared to establish permanent colonies in the New World. Likewise, to the north, Jacques Cartier explored Lawrence River, while Giovanni de Verrazzano mapped much of the east coast for France. All along the coast, the Europeans encountered the numerous tribes of Native Americans. Early interactions ranged from welcoming to violent as cultures from separate hemispheres met for the first time. As it had in the Caribbean and South America, first contact introduced these cultures to each other with the sharing of gifts and trading of information. Naturally, these meetings exposed Native Americans to European diseases and caused widespread illness and death. The first attempts to make permanent settlements in the New World began in the mid-16th century, with varying degrees of success. Surviving in the New World was not an easy task, and establishing a permanent settlement proved to be exceptionally challenging. In 1585, the English attempted to establish a permanent colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is today North Carolina. The journey across the Atlantic was brutal and left the colonists with few supplies when they arrived. Making contact with the local Aquascagak, Pamela, and Secodan tribes. The colonists, many of whom were military personnel, became embroiled in an argument with the Aquascagak and burned their village to the ground. Meetings with the Succotan went considerably better, outfitting the colonists with enough food to survive a miserable winter. Smallpox and influenza epidemics ran through every native village who encountered the colonists. Communication broke down, and violence finally convinced the colonists to move on, abandoning the colony, arriving in 1587, a year after the first attempt to settle Roanoke failed. Colonists, largely made up of middle-class Londoners with no military experience, landed on Croton Island and began to establish a settlement some 40 miles south of the first failed settlement. The colony suffered great difficulty, surviving in 1588. Mission to the colony was looted by Spanish naval vessels operating off the coast, leaving its new location unknown to English authorities. That same year, Spanish vessels sailed near Croton Island and found that it appeared abandoned. The next relief mission to the colony finally arrived in 1590 and found smoke rising from both Croatomon Island and Roanoke Island. A landing party discovered both settlements abandoned and sacked. The only clues were the letters Ciro carved into a tree and the word Croton carved into one of the posts of a palisade allegedly built by the settlers of the colony, known as the Lost Colony. The settlers of Roanoke were never discovered, the colony deemed lost by the English government. In 1564, a group of French Huguenot settlers attempted to start a colony in what would become St. Augustine, Florida, only to have the colony sacked, and all of its male citizens killed by rival Spanish forces. The settlement established by the Spanish colonists at St. Augustine is considered the first permanent European settlement in North America. In 1607, the English attempted again to establish a permanent colony in the New World. Led by the London Company, the settlement aimed to establish a colony in Virginia and selected a marshy region on the James River, which they christened Jamestown. The colony did well initially, quickly constructing living and meeting space as well as a palisade fort. Relations with the local Powhatan tribes began with hostilities, but gradually cooled over time as settlers and native peoples of the region learned to cohabitate. The Powhatan offered food and friendship to the colonists, who took the opportunity to search the surrounding region for gold and other precious metals. Instead, they found that the swampy region that they had inhabited held no riches but disease. The people of Jamestown suffered from lack of coordination, disease, and the harshness of the environment around them. Despite the aid of the Powhatan people, it was only when Captain John Smith took command of the colony and in near dictatorial fashion, reorganized their efforts to establish trade with the natives and plant crops of their own in and around the colony. Smith returned home to England not long after his term as leader of the colony, but he had established a path for the colonists to follow that allowed Jamestown to endure difficult years of famine and struggle. Jamestown survived, and by the mid-17th century was thriving as more settlements began to grow. Rounder Jamestown has the distinction of being the first English settlement to survive in the New World. In 161,912 years after the colony's founding, Jamestown became the site of yet another first. When the first African slaves arrived in Virginia, 20 to 30 enslaved Africans who had been captured by English privateers from a Spanish slave ship were brought to Point Comfort, Virginia. From there, A number were sold or traded to the settlement at Jamestown. Slavery had existed in the New World since the mid-16th century, but this moment marked the beginning of 2.5 centuries of slavery in what would become the United States. The English continued their colonial settlement in 1620 with the establishing of the Puritan colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Unlike the financially motivated London Company at Jamestown, the Puritan colonists at Plymouth, known as Pilgrims, had come to America in search of religious freedom. They voyaged across the Atlantic in the Mayflower, suffering months of terrible weather at sea. When they arrived in the New World, they first landed near what would become known as Provincetown. There, the colonists, concerned over their rights to the land and their legal right to establish a colony, drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, establishing their right to self-govern while still holding allegiance to the English crown. However, without finding a reasonable place to begin building there. And after a brief but violent encounter with a local tribe, the Puritans found Provincetown unfit and sailed up the coast for better ground. At last they decided on Plymouth Harbor, building upon an abandoned Patuxent settlement as a base for their new home. Settled between two hills on which the colonists built two forts, the colony at Plymouth initially struggled through a difficult winter, living aboard the Mayflower and building their settlement by day. In March 1621, they made first contact with the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag chief Massasoit was hesitant to trust the Pilgrims. Also uncertain of the Puritans was Squanto, a Patuxent native who had been taken in by the Wampanoag. Squanto, or Tisquantum, spoke English and had spent time in Europe after he'd been kidnapped by an English explorer in 1614. He had returned to America with another explorer whose party was ambushed, massacred by Massasoit and his tribe. Working as an interpreter, Squanto helped the Puritans and the Wampanoag reach an agreement of non-aggression. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated what has become known as the First Thanksgiving along with Chief Massasoit and several of his men. The celebration lasted for 3 days, and both parties procured and presented various dishes of local game. Like Jamestown, Plymouth was well run, and its early success was built upon by enterprising companies and individuals in England. More and more companies began crossing the Atlantic and established new settlements. Throughout the 17th century, the English began spreading as more colonies were formed and amalgamated with their fellow English neighbors. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, would absorb the Plymouth Colony and others as it grew in size. As these settlements became more established, trade opened with Europe and goods. Money and more colonists poured into the New World. Not to be outdone, other European powers attempted to create their own permanent settlements as they grabbed more and more of the coastal region for themselves. What started as small settlements along coastal waters soon became large swaths of territory claimed in the name of kings and queens from far-off European nations. In 1614, the Dutch India Company began to establish settlements in the northeast around what would one day become New York and New Jersey. Small settlements and fur trading outposts on Governor's Island and along the Hudson and rivers marked what was called New Netherlands. In 1624, fearing military incursions from other European powers, they purchased the island of Manhattan from the Munsee Lenape tribe for $24 and constructed Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of the island. The settlement, which grew within and alongside the fort, was called New Amsterdam. The settlement utilized its unique environment to expand trade and use hydropower to enhance its growth. New Amsterdam was a city of trade and commerce in its earliest form and always would be. It was a tempting target for the English who wanted control of the Hudson for themselves. In 1664, 4 English frigates sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and ordered the Dutch to surrender the city. They did so bloodlessly, although the event did spark the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In June 1665, New Amsterdam was reincorporated under English law and renamed New York City. Spain, whose early discovery of the New World gave them an advantage in colonizing South America and the Caribbean, began settling in what would become the American Southeast. From their earliest settlement in St. Augustine, the Spanish traveled inward toward there. Conquests in Mexico and upward toward Canada, carving a path through the center of the North American continent. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's North American empire would cover much of the deep south, Midwest, and western portions of the continent. France, England's longtime rival and chief competitor in North America, set their sights for permanent settlement along the St. Lawrence River, still hoping for an easy path to the Pacific. The settlements to Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal followed the winding St. Lawrence further and further inland. France established firm control of the fur trade in the region, then began to extend its influence further down the Mississippi River. In the Gulf, the French established a settlement along the bank of the Mississippi called Nouvelle Orleans or New Orleans. New Orleans was established in 1718 and was the gateway to the Mississippi, a crown jewel. France's North American empire